Okay, let's take one more breath. Breathing in peace, exhaling love, coming into this beautiful moment. Honoring that whatever happened during the day or during the week no longer exists. What's going to happen after this moment also does not exist. All that is right here now, here in this gorgeous moment, as we breathe in peace and exhale love. Fully knowing that all is well and all is well, and all manner of things are most deliciously well. Deep breath. And here we are. So, for those of you at home, I posted this in the Dunisha group, and for those of us with us live here in person, we have our handout. So we'll go ahead and open that up, and we're going to talk a little bit about today the wisdom of not being a jerk. And what's really cool is I got this sermon topic from this book, Don't Be a Jerk by Brad Warner. He's also the author of Hardcore Zen. And as you can see, it's a Godzilla alien-ish type monster destroying a village, being a jerk. And the reason all of his books have very colorful art, because he actually worked at a Japanese production company that, is it Super Eye or something like that, that did Ultraman in Japan years ago. And he was always really fascinated with like Godzilla and those type of old movies. And so it's funny how that goes into his Zen approach as well. And he was in a punk band. He has a lot of talents. But the reason why he titled this Don't Be a Jerk is he says this is kind of our current century's translation of Dogen's work from 800 years ago, which is called Shobogenzo. And so this whole book is it's I guess a modern interpretation / translation of Shobogenzo, which was one of Japan's greatest Zen masters that ever lived. And so when you break down all the teachings, it pretty much just breaks down to don't be a jerk, the essence of Buddhism. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But first I want to just start, in honor of everything that's going on right now in America, George Floyd and the riots, Minneapolis, all that stuff. Now they're springing up in different parts of the world. Today I even saw that there's protests going on in other countries now too, at the embassies. And so I'm just going to read a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. So he said, "As my sufferings mounted, I soon realized that there were two ways in which I could respond to my situation, either to react with bitterness or seek to transform the suffering into a creative force. I decided to follow the latter course." And I was actually watching way back in the day when he was on 60 Minutes, and how he actually said riots, I'm not getting it perfectly, but riots are the byproduct when voices go unheard. And so that makes a lot of sense when there's all this bubbling over of anger. But that's what's so beautiful about Buddhism and the teachings we're going to go into today, where they're teaching us what to do when there's all this built up frustrations and grief. And the beautiful thing is, whether we're going to look at this at a macro level, such as affecting the world, or we're looking at this at a micro level, such as our individual lives, this still applies. And that's what's so cool about Martin Luther King Jr. is that he was like a Zen master in and of himself. And it was so cool because Thich Nhat Hanh met him and he called him a Western Bodhisattva, a Western enlightened one that really worked actively to cultivate peace. And so pretty darn cool. One more thing. In the 60 Minutes episode, which was cool too, where he said, even if every single person on the planet and every person in his community said there needs to be a violent reaction and like protesting and going out in response to things, he would say, no, I'm still going to choose a peaceful response. And so when I heard that, I'm like, oh, this sounds really familiar to something else I heard in Shobogenzo and Brad Warner, which is this quote we're going to go into. So this is Brad Warner's interpretation, then I'm going to go into his master's translation of it, Nisojima Roshi. And so Brad Warner said, even if the whole universe is a bunch of jerks doing all types of jerk-type things, there is still liberation in simply not being a jerk. And then that's the modern interpretation, and then the actual translation would be, even if wrong upon wrong pervade the whole universe, and even if wrongs have swallowed the whole Dharma again and again, there is still salvation and liberation in not committing. And that's where it ends, but when the not committing, I guess we could say jerk type behavior, harmful behavior, if you're gonna look at a more dogmatic, dualistic, it would say just wrongdoings. But obviously here in Dunisha, we don't use right, wrong, good, bad. Instead of saying wrong, we're gonna say harm, harmful behavior, because we're taking the judgment out of it and looking at it just factually. And so that's what's fascinating, is that Martin Luther King Jr. was tapping into something there, that even if everyone in the world shouted that there needs to be a violent repercussion here, he would still say no. And that's what's fascinating, because if you look at it from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, or if you look at it from a more traditional Buddhist standpoint, when you are not committing harmful behavior, then in the Buddhist perspective, you're kind of growing your essence so that you can one day escape the cycle of samsara, of birth and rebirth, birth and rebirth, birth and rebirth. Whereas if you're from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, you get into heaven, simply put. But that's that salvation. But of course, we're not teaching from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, but I still wanted to honor that. We're teaching from a standpoint of exiting the painful cycles of harm that we commit to ourselves on a daily basis, that we commit to our families on a daily basis, and that we commit to the world on a daily basis. So how do we stop this vicious cycle from happening? Well, again, I'm gonna say it a million times today, don't be a jerk. And I just think that is such a cool way of saying it. It's a bit of a crass way of saying it, but how many of you were a jerk this week to someone, to somehow, and even a jerk type move is just speaking in a tone to someone, speaking in an upset tone to someone. Even that is jerkish. I think almost every person has probably something that they did in this past week to someone that they loved, or even maybe to themselves. Even if you look in the mirror and you say jerk type thought or think something to yourself, that is still committing the harm. Isn't that fascinating? And so I'm gonna go on to the other side of the page now. So let's go ahead and fill in our blanks here. On the top of the second page here, we have a couple fill in the blanks going on. And so when you do harm is the first fill in the blank. When you do harm, you are causing harm to appear in the world, which then goes on to create additional causes and effects. When you do harm, you are causing harm to appear in the world, which then goes on to create additional causes and effects. And so what was interesting is I also, this past week, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole of chaos theory and the butterfly effect. I'm not going to teach that today, I don't know it well enough, but I can at least talk a little bit about causes and effects. And the butterfly effect is seemingly inconsequential small changes to initial conditions can lead to large impacting results and consequences. Let me read that again. So seemingly inconsequential small changes to initial conditions can lead to large impacting results and consequences. And the reason why they call it the butterfly effect, which this is not really proven or true, but the analogy that they give is like, for example, a butterfly flapping its wings in China can create a hurricane in America, just by that small little gust from the butterfly's wings. Again, that's not how it works, but that's kind of the idea of how something so small can lead to something so drastic. But in meteorology, that happens all the time. Just small initial changes in conditions of weather can literally eventually turn into a hurricane or a tornado later on. And so what I was thinking of this is just not only all the things that led up to the death of George Floyd, but also maybe that man that did that, again, we don't know, I'm not making any assumptions here, but I doubtfully thought he realized by him putting his knee on that man, on George's neck, and then maybe not knowing that he was taking his life in the process, and how this that one thing has sparked this huge global, not even our country, but a global event. Isn't that fascinating? And what's absolutely awful is that this has happened constantly. There has been so many people, there's been so many Black people dying at the hands of officers these past few years, and then it's never stopped. But what's fascinating is that right here, the tip, we crossed the tip of the iceberg, and that butterfly effect happened, and then the whole avalanche is now spiraling down. And so I was thinking about that. So we're seeing that now on a global level, this one instance that then dominoed into so many other instances. But how does that affect our everyday lives, in which we're doing small, almost seemingly, and again, that's a very consequential action, but I wonder what the inconsequential actions that were leading up to that, if that makes sense, such as even the officers, his backstory that led up to that, all those experiences that he had that caused him to be aggressive in that way. And so what's fascinating is that you can trace that back to maybe how he was raised. You can trace that back to his unresolved woundings and his own abuse, or even the repercussions, because he had a lot of issues, and what are they called? Citations against him, and those were left not having consequences. And so you can trace it all the way back, which we can't literally do, but if you actually think about it, every person who's ever caused harm, you can always find a deep wound within themselves that was left unaddressed, that often went from possibly generation to generation to generation, the karma that passes on of not dealing with our shit, and then we accidentally spilled onto our children, and then they spilled onto their children, and then they spilled onto their workplace, and then they spilled onto their community, and then the community spills it onto the surroundings and the country, and then the country spills it onto the world. How many fucking times has America spilled their bullshit onto other countries? Right? And so that's the micro, that's the macro. And so we return to the teachings because we have to return to the peace teachings, because we recognize that the unresolved harm within myself and certain situations, even if it's not bothering most people most of the time, in certain situations, it can and will boil over and even cause death. And that's what's fascinating. And sometimes these issues even cause personal death. You know, how many people know someone who has hated being alive, and they've manifested life-taking illnesses? And it's almost just like out of the blue, you're like, holy shit. And so it's so interesting how it's not only causing violence to ourselves, but it's causing violence to the world as well. And this is why this stuff is so important. So seemingly inconsequential small changes to initial conditions can lead to large impacting results and consequences. And in Dunisha, we're really big at looking at thought forms. We're really big at looking at belief systems. And so what are the thought forms? What are the belief systems that encourage racism in America, that keep it alive? What are the thought forms and the belief systems that continuously foster self-loathing behavior, that foster discrimination, that foster immense guilt and internal suffering? Again, it's not just the external, but it's also the internal, that foster addictive behavior. What thought forms that are constantly being left unaddressed in our daily lives that continuously cause a mental and emotional violence to ourselves? And then also what belief systems are cultivated and even fostered sometimes by government agencies that are encouraging racism and discrimination, or at the least not quelling it. Interesting, isn't it? And so it's so fascinating how there's these thought forms of separation that exist that when practiced enough turn into physical, tangible reality that alter our behaviors. Does that make sense? And so that's, I think it was a couple weeks ago, I went on a whole long rant about how thought is the building block of reality, because thought turns into belief, and belief creates these filters for our emotions and our behaviors. And the way that we're perceiving life then changes the way that we're going to respond to life, and how we're responding to life changes how we interact with our relationships, and how we're having relationships changes society. And ultimately that creates a reality. And it all stems back to singular thought forms, just these tiny little seeds. And what's fascinating is a lot of racism is just, I would say all racism is conditioned. You know, when you are born into this world as this innocent creature that does not know left from right and is just experiencing, but then if you're constantly in an environment that you're absorbing these ideologies, you are going to be a bit different. And I always love this because it always cracks me up when I talk to people of different religions, and then they just claim that theirs is the absolute correct one. But I'm like, if you were born in a different country with a different religion, you'd be just as dogmatic about that one most of the time. Some people do their research and then they pick. But I'm talking about people who just have never questioned what they were brought up with, the belief systems that they never questioned. And the irony is, if they were born somewhere else in a different country with a different religion or a different political ideology that they were raised in, they would probably be just as staunch defenders of that as well. Isn't that interesting? And so it's so important to pay attention to the thought forms of what is arising within us. So let's go back to that. When you do harm, you are causing harm to appear in the world, which then goes on to create additional causes and effects. That's the point I really want to point out. Causes and effects. And then we're going to fill in the blank of the quote, the next quote, which is, when jerk type actions aren't done by someone, jerk type actions do not exist. Brad Warner. When jerk type actions aren't done by someone, jerk type actions do not exist. And then he goes on to say after that, jerk type action has no fixed form. It has no existence until someone does it. If we don't act like jerks, jerk type acts cannot exist. So all you little shits out there, which we all are to some degree, doing little shit behavior, it does not exist before it exists. We are invoking it into reality. Now we might say, well, this happened, therefore I'm going to do this in response. I was abused, therefore I'm going to do some abusive things to justify my feelings of anger. But the fascinating thing is that, yes, that existed previously, but that was someone else's, I guess we could just say karma, repeated cycle, the spilling over of pain. But it does not exist yet right here, right now. You might be still feeling the effects of it, an effect from the cause of it, but until you invoke that jerk type behavior right here, right now, it does not yet exist. You are in a neutral playing field. You have not watered those seeds, if that makes sense. Maybe there's a field, and there's all types of seeds there. There's seeds of beauty, there's seeds of suffering, there's seeds of kindness, there's seeds of judgment. But depending on what you choose to water, because that's how life works, that thing is not going to pop up. And so how do we water things? We water things with our mind. We water things with our attention. And so whatever the seeds are, wherever they're planted, if we're watering negative attention, what negative attention? Eventually it's going to pop up into negative behavior. Watering positive attention, positive attention, positive behavior is going to pop up. And again, this is just stating it very simply. Jerk type behavior, non-jerk type behavior. And so that's why it is so freaking important that we pay such close attention to our daily behaviors, because we never know how they're going to be cascading down. Isn't that interesting? We never know, the children that we are raising, who or what they're going to be blossoming into one day. They can be people that a lot of people are just neutral, but then they can also be people who invent amazing things or have great leadership capabilities, or they could be the next serial killer. No one ever thinks that they're giving birth to a serial killer. No one ever thinks that they're giving birth to someone who is going to be a domestic violence abuser. No one thinks that they're giving birth to someone. And again, It's not necessarily the birth of it, it's the conditions afterwards. Sometimes there are some mental repercussions, mental incongruencies that happen, and that's very true. But a lot of times, even if people have mental incongruencies, if they were met with the loving care and with modern science and modern attention, we can address those issues. But when we are so checked out in our own pain and we just spill that all over and we pour it into our family and our children, they're not receiving the assistance. And by the time that they're an adult and then we say, well, time to fend for yourself, they're probably not, it's already too late, if that makes sense. And so that's the fascinating thing and why I always bring it back to your home life. Bring it back to the home, bring it back to the home, bring it back to the home. Because absolutely all the tragedies that we see on the planet start within the home. Because that is where the raising and the peace or the aggression is really nurtured, if that makes sense. Fascinating stuff, isn't it? So let's go ahead and fill in the blank here. The path to enlightenment is the wisdom of not being a jerk. The path to enlightenment is the wisdom of not being a jerk. And don't worry, for those of you who know Dunisha and Living Peace, you'll probably be like, Alaric, you're not really talking about the positives. What is the opposite of being a jerk? We're going to get there. So let's go ahead and break this down. This is something that I was chewing on recently. Because I'm going to be, eventually we're getting back into full moon rituals and doing some ritual type stuff and how we honor the 4 seasons, we honor the 4 directions, we honor the 4 elements. There's so much wisdom in nature that I kind of miss teaching and experiencing. And so let's go and write this down. You're going to write 4 bullet points in the notes section and you're going to put air, fire, water, earth. Air, fire, water, earth. The first bullet point, air, next one, fire, next one, water, final one, earth. And so my invitation to all of you is while we're teaching this, just really think about what it would look like if you activated this wisdom every morning and turn this into a daily ritual. So the first one is we're going to be looking to the east. And when we look to the east, we recognize that it's the element of air. Traditionally, it's the element of air. And the negative quality of that is judgment. So you're going to put air/judgment. Or air dash, there we go, air dash judgment. And then in response to the judgment, we're going to be using the word acceptance. So it's going to be air dash judgment dash acceptance. So let's talk about that for a moment. If every single day we recognize that we're these 4 elements, they're not only within us, they're surrounding us, and we're just using the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 elements as a gateway to reflect upon them. But okay, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out, I'm recognizing the air element within me. And I also notice that it could be very sharp, and it could be very analyzing, it could be very full of judgment. So how do I balance that energy within me? I can cultivate acceptance. And what's fascinating is I'm not just talking about it just accepting, a lot of people think that acceptance is condoning. I'm not talking about condoning, harmful behaviors on the planet. What I'm talking about is accepting life that is directly in front of you as it is, rather than getting lost in thought and in full of judgment and resisting it, if that makes sense. When you're able to this is a very Zen practice, when you're able to just look at life in front of you and accepting it as it is, rather than wanting it to be different than what it is. Because here's the fascinating thing. When you're turning on the news and you're saying, oh my gosh, I wish this wasn't happening. This is so awful. You see the drone, you just keep going on and on. I wish this was different. I can't believe this is happening. Your body is not an acceptance of what's happening in the world. It's not being able to accept the fullness of what is occurring. Now, again, acceptance is not the same thing as condoning. It's being able to process. Acceptance is it's the starting point of being able to process harm so that you can then later respond to it. But if we're trapped in resisting it, you're not able to process it. And who's ever felt stress from the world and seeing things and feeling so much grief from it, right? That's because you're not in acceptance of it. You're in resistance of it, and that's not helpful. So then we move on to fire, which is dash aggression. Aggression is its negative manifestation, or again, negative is judgment. So we might say it's separating manifestation. And then you're going to do dash compassion. So aggression is the separating, while compassion is the unifying. And so we recognize the element of fire within us each morning, and we recognize that it's that energy that gets us going. It's the muscles, it's the actions, it's the motivation. And so today, am I being motivated by aggressiveness, aggression? Or am I being motivated by compassion? Am I allowing my actions to have a frustrated tone to them? Or maybe even a mindless tone to them, because even in our mindlessness or our haste, who's ever kind of hurt someone by being too hasty? Like you accidentally kind of just rushed by someone, bumped into them, and you were very mindless about it. So even hastiness in the fire element can be harmful. But instead, we reflect upon ourselves and we say, okay, how can I invite compassion into every action today? Every one of my actions, how can I invite the mindfulness of compassion? Pretty cool. So all of a sudden for the mind, we have acceptance. For the action in the body, we have compassion. And then we move on to the heart and the emotions, which is water. And let's go ahead and talk about that now. So water dash distress. Water dash distress dash tranquility. So with the water element, which we have in the heart and we have in our emotions, distress is just emotional suffering. It can be grief, it could be strife, it could be stress, it could be guilt. But it's that element of nurturing that when we are so discombobulated, it turns into distress. And our goal is instead to cultivate emotional tranquility within ourselves. So how can I invite tranquility into my heart every day? Or even just not how, but just saying every morning, I choose to invite emotional tranquility into my heart every single day. And you see how this is building. In the mind, we have acceptance. In the body, we have compassion. Now in the heart, we have tranquility. And now bringing all these three things together, which we solidify with the earth element, we have earth dash dogmatism. Earth dash dogmatism. Dash freshness. Freshness. So when the earth becomes too rigid, anyone ever know someone like that, or you yourself have become so stubborn about something or become rigid? Even if you're not religious, you could be dogmatic. You could be dogmatic about your suffering. You could be dogmatic about your story and just saying, no, this is how it is. That's it. And so dogmatism is just, even if there's facts proving otherwise, you're not changing your opinion because you're maybe emotionally invested in it, or you built your identity around it. And so we always want to remain, we want to remain free from dogmatism. And we do that by maintaining a freshness of mind, body, and heart. By inviting that fresh energy, that openness to always have a fluidity to it, rather than falling into stagnancy. And so if you really think about it, judgment, aggression, distress, and dogmatism are some of the greatest harms known to humankind. Because we know that when we're in judgment, we're creating a lot of separation and discrimination. We know that we're in aggression, fucked up behavior. We know that when we're in distress, even if we're not causing intentional harm to other people, when we are all emotionally incapacitated or discombobulated, no bueno. And then, no bueno. So simple, Alaric. Well, we not only cause violence to ourselves, but then we're spilling it onto other people. But then in earth, when we become so dogmatic in our traditions and our belief systems and our behaviors, again, it's not just about belief systems. It's even just about our behaviors and our stagnancy. Ooh. Non-action, non-change, very harmful. Think about it even with diet. Well, I've eaten this way my whole life, right? But now I'm not willing to change, even though I was diagnosed with diabetes or diagnosed with high blood pressure. You know, it's so fascinating that I've eaten this way my whole entire life, or I've drank in this way my whole entire life. I've always smoked, but now I have this illness and it's so hard to change it. That's dogmatic. Instead, we invite freshness. Freshness of mind, body, heart. Interesting, isn't it? And so I'm going to eventually, in Living Earth, there will be a ritual, a daily ritual to invoke these 4 elements within ourselves. But for at least now in this conversation, we can reflect on it and say, well, hot damn, there's something to it. And this gives a platform for us to start to look back on how we can cultivate peaceful behavior, peaceful belief systems, peaceful words, and not only our daily life, but then that spirals out to our expanded external global life. And so ultimately I'll have you write one more thing down, and it'll just be the question that you ask yourself every day. What am I choosing to set in motion? What am I choosing to set in motion? What am I choosing to set in motion? And I kind of talked about this earlier. I'm like, even when you speak in a tone, you are setting in motion violence. And so y'all's homework, if you want it, to start small, is just don't speak in a tone to people this week. Find a way. Every time you notice that that tone is coming out, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Take a breath, revisit it, and then say, I am so sorry, let me rephrase that. And maybe you're not even rephrasing the sentence, but you're just changing the tone around the sentence. Make sense? And then it's just, I love it because I wrote this down too. Take notice how your tone sculpts your experienced life. Take notice how your tone sculpts your experienced life. Very simple. Not simple, but hard to do. And then a final quote to conclude with by Martin Luther King Jr. We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself. We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. Pretty good stuff. So let's go ahead and take a deep breath, and we'll close this out. Gonna go ahead and talk to our live and YouTube family right now. I want to thank everyone for joining in today. I hope you enjoyed our sermon, and I'll be posting links below if anyone would care or is able to donate. It always drastically helps us. And I'll also put links below for YouTubers that might be watching this if you want to join our Dunisha Sanctuary online group on Facebook, where we host live meditations Monday through Friday and then live Sundays. So until then, I wish you all a happy, healthy week ahead.